The shadow never moved. Rain or shine, blizzard or heat wave, the German shepherd stood sentinel on the porch of the abandoned Mitchell house, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. The locals of Pinecrest called him the Ghost Dog, this silent guardian who'd appeared 4 years ago and never left. On this particular evening, as storm clouds gathered over the Montana mountains, the dog's fur ruffled in the rising wind. Lightning illuminated his scarred face for a brief moment, a face that had grown thinner with each passing season, yet maintained a dignified vigilance that unsettled those who saw it. Thunder cracked overhead. Most animals would seek shelter, but Max remained, his posture rigid despite the first heavy raindrops pelting his back. Only the slightest twitch of his ears betrayed his reaction when headlights appeared on the distant road, cutting through the darkening sky. This time something was different. The dog's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Pinecrest, Montana wasn't the kind of place that appeared on postcards despite the majestic mountains that framed its weathered buildings. It was a town of hard winters and brief summers, where folks minded their business and expected others to do the same. The abandoned Mitchell house sat on the eastern edge of town, its paint peeling and windows clouded with dust from neglect. Once a cheerful yellow family home, it now stood as a gray sentinel against the landscape, much like the dog who'd claimed its porch. The German shepherd? Max, as a worn tag on his collar revealed, had arrived mysteriously 4 years prior. Some said he belonged to the Mitchells, though few remembered the family clearly. They'd left under a cloud of whispers and speculation, something about legal troubles and disgrace. Whatever the truth, the dog remained, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if certain they would return. Each morning, Max patrolled the property's perimeter before resuming his post on the porch. Each evening he would lay his head on his paws, but never fully slept, alert to every passing vehicle. His once muscular frame had grown leaner, his black and tan coat duller. Yet he maintained a dignified bearing that commanded respect even from those who wished him gone. Into this scene came Abigail Thompson, Abby to everyone except her father, Frank, who called her little lady in a voice that carried too much sorrow. At 10 years old, Abby had already experienced more loss than most with her mother's passing 8 months earlier. Frank had moved them to Pinecrest, seeking a fresh start, away from Pittsburgh's memories. They'd taken the rental home across from the Mitchell place, a fact that seemed to disturb Frank more than he would admit. Their nearest neighbor, Harold Baker, lived in a small ranch house adjacent to the Mitchell property. At 72, the Vietnam veteran spent most days on his porch, watching the world with the same suspicious gaze he'd developed in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He made no secret of his disdain for the damn stray that refused to leave, though he'd been spotted leaving water bowls out during particularly hot days, a kindness he gruffly denied when questioned. As autumn surrendered to winter's first breath, these disparate souls would find their lives unexpectedly intertwined in ways none could have anticipated. The first snowfall of November dusted Pinecrest like powdered sugar on a stale cake. Abby watched it through her bedroom window, clutching the worn stuffed rabbit that had made the journey from Pittsburgh. School had proven to be a lonely experience. Small towns had long memories, but little room for newcomers. Her father had already left for his shift at the lumber mill, leaving behind a hastily scribbled note in cereal in a bowl. Wrapping herself in her mother's old scarf, still faintly scented with lavender, Abby decided to explore her new neighborhood. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a pristine white carpet that crunched satisfyingly beneath her boots. Almost instinctively, her eyes drifted to the abandoned house across the street. That's when she saw him, the German shepherd standing perfectly still on the dilapidated porch. His fur, black with tan markings, stood stark against the snow. Their eyes met across the distance, and something in the dog's gaze held her attention. Not aggression or fear, but something more complex. A quiet, dignified sorrow that resonated with her own. "He's been there forever," came a voice that made Abby jump. Harold Baker stood at his fence line wrapped in a faded military jacket. 4 years, give or take. Stubborn as a mule. "What's his name?" Abby asked, finding her voice. "Max, according to his tags. Belonged to the Mitchells, I reckon." Harold sniffed disapprovingly. "Fool dog, should have moved on like everyone else. Why doesn't someone take him in?" Harold's laugh was dry as dead leaves. "Plenty tried. Animal control came 3 times. He always finds his way back. Mayor Knowles wants him gone. Says he gives visitors the wrong impression about our town. Others leave him be. Personally, I think he's a nuisance, but—" He trailed off, his weathered face softening momentarily. "Anyway, he's not your concern, girl." But something about Max had already lodged in Abby's heart. That afternoon she approached cautiously, a piece of turkey sandwich extended in her gloved hand. Max watched her without moving, his eyes tracking her every step. When she was 10 feet away, he stood, hackles slightly raised. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm just being friendly." Max didn't growl, but he retreated to the far corner of the porch, maintaining his distance. Abby placed the sandwich on the bottom step and backed away. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised. And she did. Each day after school, Abby made the pilgrimage to the Mitchell house. Each day she left food, moving it progressively closer to where she sat cross-legged in the snow, talking to Max about her day, her mother, her difficulty making friends. After a week, Max began eating while she was still present, though keeping his distance. By the 3rd week, he took the food directly from her hand. "Dad says I shouldn't get attached," she told Max as she scratched behind his ears, a privilege recently granted. "He says you're a stray and probably dangerous." Max responded by resting his head heavily on her lap. Up close she could see the toll the years had taken, ribs visible beneath his coat, gray hairs around his muzzle, a notch missing from one ear. "You two are quite the pair," observed Mrs. Winters, the librarian, who'd stopped her car to watch them. "First time I seen that dog let anyone that close." "His name is Max," Abby corrected, protective pride in her voice. "Well, Max has been waiting there since the Mitchells left. Poor family. Such a shame what happened." Mrs. Winters shook her head. "Folks here don't like to talk about it." "What did happen?" Abby asked, seizing the opportunity. Mrs. Winters hesitated. "Not my story to tell, dear. But if you're interested in the house, the Historical Society keeps old newspaper articles." With a meaningful look, she drove away. The newspaper archives, stored in the basement of Pinecrest's tiny library, revealed little about the Mitchells. Just a small announcement of their arrival 6 years ago and a brief mention of James Mitchell's new position at the regional bank. Nothing about why they left. Meanwhile, word of Abby's friendship with Max spread through town. Frank Thompson was not pleased. "That animal could be sick or dangerous," he insisted over dinner. "Harold Baker said it nearly bit him once." "Mr. Baker throws rocks at him," Abby retorted, pushing peas around her plate. "And Max is not an it. He's waiting for someone. I can feel it." Frank sighed, the exhaustion of single parenthood evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Abby, not everything has a happy ending. Sometimes people and animals get left behind. That's just life." "Like Mom left us behind." The words escaped before she could stop them. The stunned silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Frank's fork clattering against his plate. "That's not fair, Abigail," he said finally, his voice tight. "Your mother didn't choose to leave." "Neither did Max," she whispered. The following weekend, a town council meeting included a heated discussion about the stray dog situation. Mayor Knowles argued forcefully for animal control to remove the nuisance once and for all. The animal is unsightly, potentially dangerous, and detracts from our town's appeal to tourists and prospective residents, he declared, gesturing toward Calvin Reed, a developer from Missoula, who nodded emphatically. To Abby's surprise, several residents spoke in Max's defense. Mrs. Winters mentioned his gentle demeanor with Abby. Old Mr. Gunderson recalled how the dog had barked frantically until someone checked on elderly Miss Abernathy during last year's power outage, possibly saving her life. Harold Baker, to everyone's astonishment, stood up. "That dog's got more loyalty than most people I know," he growled, glaring at Mayor Knowles. "Been there 4 years waiting no matter the weather. Doesn't bother nobody who doesn't bother him first." He didn't look at Abby, but she felt his words were partly for her. The council voted to postpone any decision, leaving Max's fate uncertain. That night, a fierce argument erupted between Abby and her father when she declared her intention to continue visiting Max. "I won't lose you too," Frank shouted, his voice breaking. "A stray dog, Abby. That's what you're risking our relationship over?" The hurt in his eyes made Abby's heart ache, but she couldn't explain the connection she felt to the patient's shepherd. It was as if Max understood something about waiting and loss that no one else in Pinecrest could comprehend. Next morning, Abby found Max's collar on her doorstep, cut cleanly through. When she rushed to the Mitchell house, the porch stood empty for the first time in 4 years. Panic seized Abby's chest as she stared at the empty porch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wood where Max should have been standing. She called his name, her voice echoing in the crisp winter air, but only silence answered. "Looking for your mutt?" Calvin Reed's smooth voice came from behind her. The developer leaned against his shiny SUV, an expression of false sympathy on his face. "Animal control picked him up early this morning. Mayor's orders." "You can't do that." Abby clutched Max's severed collar to her chest. Reed shrugged. "Town council meetings' decisions are just recommendations, not law. Mayor Knowles has authority over public nuisances." He gestured toward the Mitchell property. "This eyesore has been holding up progress long enough. I've got plans for this land, plans that will bring Pinecrest into the modern era." Abby fought back tears. "Where did they take him?" "American County Shelter in Whitefish. But don't get your hopes up, kid. Aggressive strays don't usually last long there." As Reed walked away, Abby heard the shuffle of boots on gravel. Harold Baker stood at his property line, a scowl deepening the lines on his weathered face. "Mr. Baker, they took Max." She held up the collar. "We have to do something." The old veteran's expression remained stony. "Not my problem, girl." "But you defended him at the meeting." "I spoke my piece. Doesn't mean I'm getting involved." He turned to go, then paused. "County Shelter opens at 10, 45-minute drive to Whitefish." With that, he disappeared into his house. Abby knew her father wouldn't help. He'd be relieved Max was gone. With a determined set to her jaw, she ran home and emptied her piggy bank. $23.42. Not enough for a taxi, and the local bus only ran on weekdays. As she sat on her front steps, desperation mounting, a battered pickup truck stopped in front of her house. Harold Baker leaned across the passenger seat and pushed open the door. "You comin' or not?" he grunted. The drive to Whitefish passed in tense silence. Finally, as they approached the town limits, Harold spoke. "Your daddy know where you are?" Abby stared at her hands. "I left a note." Harold made a disapproving sound. "Man's already lost his wife. Shouldn't have to worry about losing his daughter, too." "I'm not losing myself," Abby protested. "I'm saving Max." "Dog's not your responsibility." "Then whose is he?" Harold didn't answer, but his gnarled hands tightened on the steering wheel. The county animal shelter was a low concrete building on the outskirts of Whitefish. Inside, the sharp smell of disinfectant barely masked the underlying scent of too many animals in too small a space. A tired-looking woman manned the front desk. "We're looking for a German Shepherd," Harold said before Abby could speak. "Picked up this morning from Pinecrest." The woman typed into her computer. "Oh, the Mitchell dog. He's in holding area 3. She eyed them suspiciously. "Are you the owners?" "No, but Abby began. "Family friends," Harold interrupted. "Came as soon as we heard." The woman seemed unconvinced, but buzzed them through to the kennel area. The cacophony of barking dogs assaulted their ears. They found Max in a large cage at the far end, standing alert, his eyes fixed on the door, as if still expecting someone to walk through it. "Max!" Abby called. The dog's ears perked up, and he rushed to the cage door, pressing his nose through the bars. She fell to her knees, rubbing his ears through the cage. "We came to take you home." "It'll be $85 for the release fee," the shelter worker informed them, "plus proof of residence and ID. Harold pulled out his wallet. "I've got ID, and I live next door to where the dog stays." "But you're not the registered owner," the woman shook her head. "Without proof of ownership, this dog is classified as a stray and will be held for the mandatory waiting period. If unclaimed by the actual owner, he'll be evaluated for adoption eligibility." "What if he doesn't pass?" Abby asked, her voice small. The woman's silence was answer enough. "Now listen here." Harold's voice took on the commanding tone of his military days. "That dog has been waiting at the same house for 4 years. The Mitchells are gone, but they're coming back. Max knows it." "Sir, I don't make the rules." "And let us talk to whoever does," Harold insisted. An hour of arguments and phone calls later, they left the shelter, empty-handed. Max would remain in custody for at least 7 days. If no owner claimed him, he would undergo behavioral assessment. His age and potential territorial aggression worked against him. The drive back to Pinecrest was even quieter than the journey out. Halfway home, Abby finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" Harold kept his eyes on the road. "I'm not helping you. I'm doing what's right." "What do you care about Max now? You always said he was a nuisance." The old man was silent for so long Abby thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, "My unit had a dog in Nam, Scout, German Shepherd like your Max. Best damned dog you'd ever meet. Saved our lives more times than I can count." His voice grew distant, lost in memory. "When we pulled out, they wouldn't let us take him, classified him as equipment, left him behind." Me didn't know what to say. Harold cleared his throat roughly. "Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We need to find the Mitchells if we want to get Max out." Upon returning to Pinecrest, they went straight to the abandoned house. This time, Harold didn't wait at the property line, but walked with Abby onto the porch. "Never been inside," he admitted. "Felt like trespassing." The front door was locked, but a back window had been left unlatched. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Furniture covered with dust cloths, dishes still in cupboards, family photos still on walls. It was as if the Mitchells had intended to return. In what had clearly been a young boy's bedroom, Abby found a photo of Max with a small, dark-haired child. The boy was laughing, arms wrapped around the dog's neck. "Ethan Mitchell," Harold identified the child. "He'd be about 8 now. Good kid." A memory book sat on a shelf, and inside Abby found what they needed. An envelope with James Mitchell's handwriting containing bills from an address in Bozeman. "They're still in Montana?" she breathed. Harold nodded, his expression grim. "Question is, will they want Max back after all this time?" They repaired to leave. A noise from the front of the house froze them in place. The door handle turned slowly. "Who's in there?" Frank Thompson's voice called, tight with anger and fear. "Webbe, I swear to God, If you're in there." The door swung open to reveal not only her father, but Mayor Knowles and Calvin Reed behind him. Reed's smile was triumphant. "Breaking and entering," he announced. "Now we can press charges." Frank Thompson's face cycled through emotions: relief at finding his daughter, anger at her disobedience, and confusion at Harold Baker's presence. "Abby, what are you doing? I've been looking everywhere for you." Before Abby could answer, Calvin Reed pushed past Frank into the house. "This property is scheduled for inspection today. You're trespassing on what will soon be private development land." Harold stepped forward, positioning himself between Reed and Abby. "Last I checked, the Mitchells still own this house. Taxes are paid up through an estate service." "How would you know that?" Mayor Knowles asked, his round face flushed from the cold. "'Cause I've been keeping an eye on things," Harold replied gruffly. "Someone had to, after the way this town turned its back on 'em." Frank looked bewildered. "Will someone please tell me what's going on? Abby, the note you left just said you were going to save Max. I've been out of my mind with worry." Abby clutched the photo of Ethan and Max to her chest. "They took Max to the county shelter. They're going to kill him if his owners don't claim him." "The Mitchell dog was removed as a public nuisance," Mayor Knowles stated flatly. "The council vote was inconclusive, but as mayor, I have authority." "You have the authority to listen to your constituents," Harold interrupted. "Half the town spoke up for that dog, and you ignored him because Reed here wants to bulldoze this property." Reed's smile tightened. "Progress requires change, Mr. Baker. Pinecrest needs economic development, not sentiment about an abandoned house and a stray dog." "He's not a stray," Abby's voice rang through the dusty room. "He belongs to the Mitchells, and they're still in Montana. We found their address." Reed and the mayor exchanged a quick glance that didn't escape Harold's notice. Frank moved to his daughter's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "I think it's time we left," Frank said quietly. "Whatever's happening here is bigger than a dog." "Nothing's happening here except trespassing," Reed insisted. "I'll be generous and not press charges if you leave immediately. The girl can keep her fantasies about reuniting the dog with its long-gone family." Harold's weathered face hardened. "What are you so afraid of, Reed? That the Mitchells might come back and interfere with your plans?" Mayor Knowles stepped between them. "That's enough, Harold. The Mitchells aren't coming back to Pinecrest, not after what happened." "And what exactly did happen?" Frank asked, his arm still around Abby. "'Cause my daughter seems caught in the middle of something no one will talk about." An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally Harold spoke, his voice low and measured. "James Mitchell was the regional bank manager. 4 years ago he was accused of embezzling funds, nearly $500,000. The evidence seemed clear-cut. Rather than face prosecution, the family disappeared overnight." "They didn't disappear," Abby protested. "They're in both." "The point is," Reed interjected smoothly, "the Mitchell property has been in legal limbo. The bank has been negotiating with their lawyers for years. Finally, they've agreed to sell to recover some of the losses James Mitchell caused." "And conveniently, you're the buyer," Harold observed dryly. Reed straightened his expensive coat. "I have a vision for Pinecrest. Affordable vacation homes that will bring tourism dollars and jobs. This property is the perfect location for the development's entrance and community center." Frank looked down at Abby, whose face was set in stubborn determination. "Sweetheart, I understand you care about Max, but this is complicated adult business." "It's not complicated," she insisted. "Max has been waiting for them, and they're still in Montana. We need to find them." "Enough of this nonsense," Mayor Knowles huffed. "The Mitchell dog will be handled according to county regulations, and this property matter is already settled. Now, I suggest you all leave before I'm forced to call Sheriff Denton." Outside, the winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. Frank led Abby to their car while Harold returned to his truck. As they prepared to leave, Harold called out to Frank. "Thompson, a word?" Frank hesitated, then nodded to Abby. "Wait in the car, honey." The two men conferred for several minutes, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Finally Frank returned, his expression troubled. "What did Mr. Baker say?" Abby asked as they drove home. Frank sighed heavily. "That's between him and me for now." After a pause he added, "But we're not done with this Max situation. I promise." That night Abby overheard her father on the phone, his voice uncharacteristically animated. Names like State Banking Commission and Evidence Review filtered through her bedroom door. When she asked about it over breakfast, Frank merely said he was looking into some things. 3 days passed with no word about Max. Abby visited the Mitchell house daily, half expecting to see him back at his post, but the porch remained empty. On the 4th morning, Harold Baker appeared at their door, holding a thick manila envelope. "Found something you should see," he told Frank, nodding curtly to Abby. The men spread papers across the kitchen table. Bank statements, internal memos, and newspaper clippings. As they pored over the documents, Abby slipped closer to listen. "The timing doesn't add up," Frank muttered, tapping a bank statement. "These transactions were logged after James Mitchell's credentials were deactivated." Harold nodded grimly. "Someone else used his access. Question is, who stood to gain from framing him?" Abby's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Mr. Reed?" Both men looked up, startled by her insight. Frank frowned, but Harold's weathered face creased in a reluctant smile. "Smart kid," he acknowledged. "Calvin Reed was on the bank's board of directors 4 years ago. He resigned just after the Mitchell scandal to focus on development opportunities. And now he's buying the Mitchell property at a fraction of its value," Frank added, the pieces connecting in his mind. "We need to find the Mitchells," Abby insisted. "They need to know the truth, and they need to come back for Max." Frank exchanged a long look with Harold. "It's not that simple, Abby. Even if James Mitchell was framed, coming back could mean reopening old wounds. And they might not be able to take Max. We don't know their situation. But we have to try." Tears welled in Abby's eyes. "Max has been waiting for 4 years. 4 years, Dad. He never gave up on them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning beyond the dog's situation. Frank's expression softened as he pulled his daughter into a hug. "Okay," he whispered into her ear. "We'll try." The address in Bozeman led to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Frank insisted on making the 3-hour drive alone, leaving Abby in Harold's reluctant care. The old veteran and the young girl spent an awkward afternoon drinking hot chocolate and playing checkers, neither mentioning the reason for their vigil. When Frank finally returned that evening, his expression was unreadable. "They weren't there," he said simply. "Moved out 6 months ago, according to the landlord." Abby's shoulders slumped in defeat. "But," Frank continued, "I got their new address. They're in Missoula now." Hope flared in Abby's chest. "Did you go there? Did you see them?" Frank shook his head. It was getting late. And he hesitated. "This isn't something to rush into. The Mitchells have rebuilt their lives. James is working construction now. Sarah's a cashier at a grocery store. They downsized from a house to a small apartment." "It'll be because of what happened here," Harold muttered. Frank nodded solemnly. "I did some more digging. The embezzlement case was never fully prosecuted because James Mitchell agreed to surrender his financial licenses and pay restitution, which took nearly everything they had. He's been making monthly payments for 4 years for a crime he might not have committed. But if Mr. Reed framed him, we can prove it," Abby protested. "It's not that simple," Frank explained gently. "The evidence is circumstantial at best. We'd need access to bank records that only a court order could provide." Harold cleared his throat. There might be another way. Martin Guthrie at the First Bank of Montana was James's mentor. He never believed James was guilty. He might still have access to records that could help. Frank looked skeptical. Breaking banking confidentiality is a serious offense. She is framing an innocent man and destroying his life, Harold countered. Meanwhile, time was running out for Max. His 7-day hold at the shelter would end tomorrow, after which he would be evaluated for adoption or worse. That night Abby couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Max, alone in a cage, still waiting after all this time. Around midnight she heard the front door open and close softly. Looking out her window, she saw her father's car pulling away. Early the next morning Frank returned, looking exhausted but determined. He placed a USB drive on the kitchen table. "Martin Guthrie sends his regards," he said to Harold, who had arrived moments earlier. "Said to tell you that sometimes doing right means bending the rules." The drive contained internal bank communications and transaction logs that painted a damning picture. Calvin Reed had authorized the transfers using James Mitchell's credentials during times when James was verifiably elsewhere. Most telling was a series of emails between Reed and offshore accounts where the missing money had been traced. Accounts that had funded Reed's initial development projects. "This is enough to reopen the case," Frank said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But it's not enough to help Max today. The shelter would open in 1 hour. Max's fate would be decided by strangers who knew nothing of his loyalty or the injustice that had separated him from his family." Abby felt tears welling in her eyes. "We need to get him out," she whispered. Harold and Frank exchanged looks. "I might have a temporary solution," Harold offered hesitantly. "I called in a favor with David Larson at the shelter. He agreed to release Max to me as a foster, pending resolution of the ownership issue." Abby's face lit up. "So Max can come home?" "To my home," Harold clarified. "Temporarily, until we sort this out." Frank nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Harold. That gives us time to contact the Mitchells properly." "The boy, Ethan," Harold said quietly. "He'd be about 8 now. He might not even remember Max." The thought was heartbreaking, but Abby refused to accept it. "He'll remember. Max remembers him." 3 hours later, Max cautiously stepped out of Harold's truck and onto Pinecrest soil once again. His ears were alert, his posture tense as he scanned his surroundings. When he recognized the Mitchell house in the distance, he strained against his new leash. "Easy, boy," Harold murmured. "Not yet." For the next 2 days, Max stayed with Harold, but he spent every daylight hour watching the Mitchell house from Harold's front porch. He accepted food and water, but remained restless, occasionally whining as he stared at his former post. Frank worked tirelessly, making calls to the State Banking Commission and the District Attorney's Office. The evidence on the USB drive had opened doors, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Calvin Reed, sensing trouble, accelerated his timeline for acquiring the Mitchell property, scheduling a final contract signing with the bank for the end of the week. On Wednesday morning, Mayor Knowles appeared at Harold's door, Sheriff Denton at his side. "We've received a complaint that you're harboring a dangerous animal," the mayor announced, not bothering with pleasantries. Harold stood firm in his doorway, Max at his heel. "There's no dangerous animal here. Just a dog waiting for his family. Mr. Reed reported that the dog lunged at him yesterday when he was inspecting the property line," Sheriff Denton said, sounding unconvinced of his own words. "Reed hasn't been near my property," Harold countered, "and Max hasn't left my yard." "Nevertheless," Mayor Knoll pressed, "the county ordinance is clear. After a complaint, the animal must be surrendered for evaluation." The confrontation drew attention. Neighbors emerged from their homes, including Frank and Abby Thompson. Mrs. Winters from the library joined them, along with several others who had supported Max at the town meeting. "This is harassment," Frank called out, striding toward the group, "and it stops now." Sheriff Denton looked uncomfortable. "Frank, I'm just doing my job." "Your job includes investigating false reports," Frank replied evenly. "Calvin Reed is trying to remove obstacles to his development plans. First the dog, then the evidence of his fraud." Mayor Knowles puffed up indignantly. "That's a serious accusation against a respected businessman?" "An accusation backed by evidence," Frank stated, pulling papers from his jacket. "Evidence that's already been submitted to the State Banking Commission and the district attorney." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Mayor Knowles' face reddened. "This is local police business, Thompson. Your banking conspiracy theories don't change the fact that the dog needs to be removed." "Actually," came a new voice, "that's not your decision to make." All heads turned to see a sedan with out-of-town plates parked at the curb. A man in his mid-30s stood beside it, his face weathered beyond his years. Behind him, a woman and young boy remained in the car, watching anxiously. "James Mitchell," Harold breathed. At the sound of the name, Max's entire demeanor changed. His ears perked forward, his body quivering with sudden energy. A high, hopeful whine escaped his throat. James Mitchell looked at the German shepherd with an expression of disbelief and dawning recognition. "Max? My God, is that really you?" In that moment, Max broke free from Harold's grasp. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in alarm. But Max wasn't charging aggressively. He raced toward James Mitchell with a grace that belied his years, his tail a blur of joyous movement. James knelt in the snow as Max reached him, his arms opening to receive the dog he'd thought long lost. Max's whines turned to joyful yelps as he frantically licked James's face, his entire body wiggling with 4 years of pent-up devotion. The woman and boy emerged from the car now. Sarah Mitchell pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. Ethan hung back, uncertain, no longer the toddler who had romped with the young dog in the photos. He waited," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time." Max, sensing her presence, bounded over to Sarah next, nearly knocking her down in his enthusiasm. She laughed through her tears, kneeling to embrace him. "I told you," Abby whispered to her father. "I told you he was waiting for them." Mayor Knowles and Sheriff Denton stood awkwardly to the side, their official purpose now unclear. The gathering of neighbors had grown, whispers spreading rapidly about the returned family and Calvin Reed's alleged crimes. As the initial emotion of the reunion subsided, James Mitchell straightened, his hand resting on Max's head as if he couldn't bear to break contact. He faced the town officials with quiet dignity. "I understand there's been some confusion about Max's ownership," he said. "Let me clarify. He is our dog. He has always been our dog. The fact that he waited for us," his voice caught, "that he never gave up when everyone else did, that's a loyalty we don't deserve, but we'll spend the rest of his life repaying." Sheriff Denton nodded, clearly relieved to have the situation resolved. "That settles the animal complaint, then." He tipped his hat to the Mitchells and retreated to his vehicle. Mayor Knowles hesitated, then followed, avoiding the accusing stares of his constituents. As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan Mitchell finally approached Max cautiously. The boy had been only 4 when they'd left, too young to have clear memories of the dog. Max sensed his uncertainty and calmed immediately, sitting down and offering a paw, as he'd been taught long ago. A flicker of recognition crossed Ethan's face. Tentatively, he took the paw. "Good boy," he whispered. Max responded by gently licking his hand. James turned to Harold and Frank. "Someone called us yesterday, said we needed to come back to Pinecrest right away. that it was about Max and the truth about what happened 4 years ago. Frank looked surprised. It wasn't me. I was planning to drive out to see you this weekend. Harold shifted uncomfortably. Wasn't my place to make that call. All eyes turned to Abby, who blushed under the attention. I found your number in the phone book, she admitted. I just told him that Max had been waiting and that we found evidence Mr. Reed framed Mr. Mitchell. James Mitchell knelt to Abby's level. You're the one who's been taking care of Max? She nodded. Not for long. He wouldn't let anyone close for years, but he let me be his friend. Then we owe you a debt we can never repay, James said solemnly. Max is family. When we had to leave so suddenly, we searched for him for weeks, but he'd disappeared. We thought... He couldn't finish. He came back to your house, Abby explained. He's been waiting there every day for 4 years. Sarah Mitchell joined them, wiping her tears. We couldn't come back to look. The terms of James's settlement with the bank prohibited him from returning to Pinecrest. A settlement based on false evidence, Frank added. Evidence that's now being reviewed by the proper authorities. As they talked, no one noticed Calvin Reed's SUV approaching until it stopped abruptly at the sight of the gathered group. Reed stared in disbelief at the Mitchell family, his face draining of color as he realized what their presence might mean. Max, spotting Reed, let out a deep, rumbling growl, the first aggressive sound anyone had heard from him. James placed a calming hand on his head. It's okay, boy, he said quietly. I think Mr. Reed is just leaving. Reed's SUV reversed hastily and disappeared down the street. The Mitchells had come with no expectation of staying. They'd been living in a small apartment in Missoula, slowly rebuilding their lives from the financial devastation of the false accusations. The idea of returning to Pinecrest permanently seemed impossible. But as word spread through town of the Mitchells' return and Reed's alleged fraud, something unexpected happened. People began to gather at Harold's house where the family was taking shelter. Not out of curiosity, but with offers of support. Mrs. Winters brought old photo albums from the Historical Society. Mr. Gunderson arrived with his toolbox, offering to help make repairs on the Mitchell house, which had fallen into disrepair. Even Mayor Knowles eventually appeared, looking chastened, to inform them that the town council would be reviewing the sale of their property at an emergency meeting. As the day drew to a close, the Mitchells, the Thompsons, and Harold sat on Harold's porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. Max lay contentedly at Ethan's feet, occasionally looking up to ensure his family was still there. What happens now? Abby asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. James Mitchell gazed at his former home across the way. I don't know. We built a life in Missoula. Coming back here, there are memories both good and painful. But there's also justice, Frank pointed out, and a community that seems ready to make amends. Sarah Mitchell reached for her husband's hand. And there's a dog who never lost faith in us, even when we lost faith in ourselves. As if understanding her words, Max raised his head and gave a soft, contented sigh. Winter in Montana arrived with characteristic ferocity. 3 days after the Mitchells returned to Pinecrest, a blizzard descended from the mountains, enveloping the town in swirling white. The storm's timing could not have been worse. The Mitchells had decided to stay temporarily in their old house, now partially habitable thanks to the efforts of neighbors who had spent 2 days replacing broken windows, fixing the furnace, and cleaning years of dust. The family's modest belongings from Missoula were scheduled to arrive the following day, now delayed indefinitely by impassable roads. In Harold Baker's home, where the Mitchells had spent their first night back in town, Abby Thompson pressed her nose against the window, watching the snow pile against the glass. "Do you think Max is okay over there?" she asked, unable to hide the worry in her voice. Carl grunted from his armchair. "Dog survived 4 Montana winters on that porch. He'll be fine in a house with his family." But Abby couldn't shake her concern. Something about the storm's intensity felt ominous, as if nature itself objected to the disruption of the status quo in Pinecrest. Across town, Calvin Reed paced his rental cabin, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care about the weather," he snapped. "The closing is scheduled for tomorrow. Mitchell's return changes nothing. Legally, the bank can still sell that property." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Fine. Monday, then. But no later." He slammed the phone down, his carefully constructed facade of civility cracking under pressure. Reed had built his career on calculated risks and an uncanny ability to identify vulnerable targets. James Mitchell had been both, talented enough to take the fall credibly, desperate enough not to fight back when presented with evidence of his crimes. The return of the Mitchells threatened everything Reed had worked toward, but he wasn't finished yet. There were other ways to ensure the development proceeded as planned. At the Mitchell home, James sat at his old kitchen table, a stack of documents spread before him. Sarah moved about the space, rediscovering the home they had fled in such haste 4 years earlier. Ethan sat on the floor beside Max, the boy and dog cautiously rebuilding their bond. The German shepherd hadn't left the child's side since their reunion, as if afraid the family might disappear again. "It's all here," James said quietly, examining bank statements that Frank Thompson had provided, the transaction trails, the timestamp anomalies, even Reed's emails to the offshore accounts. He shook his head in disbelief. "How did I not see this?" "You weren't looking for it," Sarah reminded him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You trusted Reed. Everyone did." The sound of howling wind drew their attention as the storm intensified. Max's ears perked up, his body tensing. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, sensing the change in the dog's demeanor. A loud crack rent the air, followed by the distinctive splintering of wood. James rushed to the window in time to see a massive pine tree crash onto the power line leading to their house. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the home into darkness. "Everyone stay calm," James called. "There are flashlights in the kitchen drawer if they're still there." Sarah found candles instead, their emergency supplies long since removed. As she lit them, the temperature in the house noticeably dropped. Without electricity, the recently repaired furnace had gone silent. "The storm's supposed to last through the night," Sarah said, concern edging her voice. "It's already below zero out there." James assessed their situation grimly. They had limited food, no heat, and a house that after years of neglect was far from weathertight. The sensible option would be to seek shelter elsewhere, but the blizzard made travel dangerous, if not impossible. Max paced anxiously between family members, his instincts alerting him to their predicament. Suddenly he stopped, head tilted toward the kitchen as if hearing something beyond human perception. Before anyone could react, he bolted toward the back door, scratching insistently. "What's gotten into him?" Sarah wondered. James followed Max to the door and opened it cautiously. Snow immediately swirled into the kitchen, but Max didn't dash out, as expected. Instead, he barked once, sharply, then turned back to James with unmistakable intent. "I think he wants us to follow him," James said uncertainly. "Follow him where? Into a blizzard?" Sarah protested. Max barked again, more urgently, moving between the door and the family. Ethan tugged his mother's sleeve. "Dad says Max saved me from drowning once when I was little. I don't remember it, but—" "Maybe we should trust him." James made a quick decision. "Get your coats and anything warm. If Max thinks there's danger, I believe him." They bundled up hastily, Sarah wrapping Ethan in every available layer, and stepped into the brutal cold. Max immediately took the lead, his dark fur almost invisible against the night. The family followed close behind, forming a human chain with James at the front and Sarah at the rear, Ethan protected between them. The journey was arduous despite the short distance. Wind-driven snow stung their faces and the accumulated drifts reached mid-thigh in places. Max forged ahead, occasionally circling back to ensure they followed. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, a glow appeared through the whiteout conditions. Harold Baker's home. Max led them not to the front door, but around to a cellar entrance. He scratched at the doors insistently until James managed to pull one open. The dog immediately descended into the darkness below, his certainty never wavering. "He knows where he's going," James shouted over the wind. "Let's trust him." The cellar was cold, but blessedly free from the punishing wind. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah gasped. One wall had partially collapsed, revealing a glow from the adjacent space, Harold's furnace room. Max continued toward the light, squeezing through the gap. The Mitchells followed, emerging into the welcome warmth of Harold's basement. Upstairs, the commotion alerted Harold and the Thompsons. Harold appeared at the basement door, shotgun in hand, only to lower it in surprise at the sight of the snow-covered family climbing the stairs. "Mitchell? What in God's name—" "Max," James explained simply, helping Sarah and Ethan up the final steps. "He brought us here when our power went out. Somehow he knew about the connected cellars." Harold's weathered face registered surprise. "Those old bootleggered tunnels haven't been used in decades. Didn't think anyone remembered them but me." Frank Thompson appeared behind Harold, Abby peering around his legs. Her face lit up at the sight of Max, now shaking snow from his coat. "I knew he'd keep you safe," she declared with a child's absolute certainty. As the adults helped the Mitchells out of their frozen outer layers, Max collapsed near the fireplace, his mission accomplished. Only then did they notice the blood. "He's hurt!" Ethan cried, rushing to his dog's side. A deep gash ran along Max's right flank, already crusting with ice and snow. In his determination to lead his family to safety, he had apparently injured himself on something sharp, perhaps debris from the fallen tree, and given no indication of his pain. "We need to get him to a vet," Sarah said urgently. Frank shook his head grimly. "Roads are impassable. Phone lines are down, too." He hesitated. "But Elaine Foster, the vet, lives just down the street. If we could get word to her somehow." Harold was already pulling on his coat. "I'll go. Got snowshoes in the shed." James stepped forward. "I'm coming with you. Max saved us. Now it's our turn." Reluctantly, Harold nodded. The two men prepared to venture back into the storm, while Frank helped Abby and Sarah make Max comfortable. They cleaned his wound as best they could with supplies from Harold's first aid kit, but the dog's breathing had grown labored, and his normally alert eyes appeared dull. "Hang on, boy," Ethan whispered, stroking Max's head. "Please, hang on." Outside, Harold and James battled the elements. The snowshoes helped, but the wind was disorienting, visibility near zero. Harold led by memory alone, counting houses by feel as they passed submerged fences and mailboxes. "Never thought I'd be risking my neck for that dog," Harold shouted over the wind. "Spent years wishing he'd just go away." "What changed?" James called back. Harold didn't answer immediately, focusing on maintaining their course. Finally, he said, "Saw myself in him, I guess. Stubborn old soldier who couldn't let go of the past." He paused. "And the girl, Abby, she saw something in him worth saving when the rest of us were blind to it." Dr. Foster's home appeared like a mirage in the swirling snow, a single window glowing with candlelight. The veterinarian answered their pounding with a shotgun of her own, lowering it only when she recognized Harold through his snow-crusted beard. "Harold Baker, you'd better be dying to be out in this," she greeted him. "Not me, the Mitchell dog. Bad gash, losing blood." Recognition flickered across her face. "The German Shepherd that's been waiting at the old house? I heard the Mitchells were back." She regarded James with open curiosity. "Please," James said, desperation in his voice. "He saved our lives tonight." Dr. Foster nodded once, decisively. "Let me get my emergency kit." The return journey was even more treacherous, now slowed by Dr. Foster's presence. Twice they lost their way, turned around by the disorienting sameness of the snow-covered landscape. It was Max's distant barking, somehow sensing their predicament, that finally guided them back to Harold's home. Inside, the situation had deteriorated. Max lay motionless by the fire, his breathing shallow. Ethan sat beside him, tears streaming silently down his face. Abby held the dog's paw, whispering encouragements. Dr. Foster immediately went to work, her practiced hands assessing the damage. "Laceration's deep, he's lost a lot of blood, and there's early signs of hypothermia and shock." She looked up at the anxious faces surrounding her. "I need to operate now." Here, what followed was a makeshift surgery by firelight. Dr. Foster worked with calm efficiency, stitching the wound while administering fluids through an IV line. Harold's dining table became an operating theater, sterilized with whiskey from his emergency supplies. "Is strong," Dr. Foster murmured as she worked. "Must be, to have survived alone for so long." "He wasn't alone," Abby corrected quietly. "He was waiting." "There's a difference." The procedure seemed to last an eternity. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Harold's home, time stood suspended around the injured dog who had become the heart of their unlikely gathering. Finally, Dr. Foster straightened, rolling her shoulders to release the tension. "I've done what I can. The next few hours will tell." Max remained unconscious, his breathing slightly stronger but still irregular. Dr. Foster explained he needed blood, antibiotics, and proper monitoring equipment, none of which were available in their storm-isolated location. "We'll take shifts," James decided. "Watch him through the night." No one argued. As the hours passed, they rotated places beside Max, each person speaking softly to the unconscious dog, urging him to fight, to stay. During Ethan's watch, near dawn, the boy fell asleep with his head resting gently against Max's uninjured side. It was Abby who noticed first, Max's tail thumping weakly against the floor, his eyes open, watching the sleeping child with undisguised devotion. "He's awake," she whispered excitedly, careful not to disturb Ethan. The adults gathered around, relief visible on every face. Dr. Foster checked Max's vitals, her professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal her surprise. "I seen dogs pull through worse," she admitted, "but rarely with such determination. He really wants to live." "Of course he does," Abby said with absolute conviction. "He waited 4 years to find his family. He's not leaving them now." As morning approached, the storm's fury began to abate. First light revealed a transformed landscape, Pinecrest buried under feet of snow, trees toppled, power lines down. But inside Harold's home, the atmosphere was one of cautious celebration. Max had survived the night. Dr. Foster prepared to leave, promising to return with better medical supplies once the roads were partially cleared. "Keep him quiet and warm," she instructed. "No excitement, no movement." As if understanding her words, Max remained dutifully still, his eyes tracking everyone in the room, but his body at rest. Only his tail occasionally betrayed his contentment when Ethan or Abby drew near. The front window suddenly illuminated with flashing lights. Through the snow-crusted glass, they could make out a county snowplow, followed by an official vehicle. "Must be emergency services checking for stranded residents," Frank suggested. Harold peered outside, then stiffened. "It's Sheriff Denton. And he's not alone. Reed's with him." James moved to the window. Indeed, Calvin Reed stood beside the sheriff's SUV, pointing emphatically toward Harold's house. Even from a distance, his expression was one of barely contained rage. "What's he doing here?" Sarah asked, instinctively moving closer to Ethan. James's face hardened. "My guess? Making sure the storm didn't interfere with his plans." He reached for his coat. Time to end this once and for all. Max struggled to his feet, swaying but determined, his ears alert to the tension in his owner's voice. "No, boy," James said gently, pressing him back down. "You've done your part. This fight is mine." The German shepherd reluctantly settled, his eyes never leaving James as he stepped outside to confront the man who had destroyed their lives once before. James Mitchell stepped out into the blinding white morning, each footfall breaking through the crust of snow. The biting cold assaulted his face as he approached Sheriff Denton and Calvin Reed, who stood like dark sentinels against the pristine landscape. Behind him he sensed, rather than saw, Harold and Frank following at a cautious distance. "Mitchell," Sheriff Denton nodded curtly. "Glad to see you folks made it through the storm. We're checking on residents, making sure everyone's accounted for." Calvin Reed made no pretense of similar concern. His expensive parka seemed out of place against the rural backdrop, as did the contemptuous curl of his lip. "Quite the touching reunion I witnessed yesterday. The prodigal banker returns to his humble beginnings." James felt a rush of anger, but kept his voice steady. "What do you want, Reed? You've gone to a lot of trouble to get here when the roads are barely passable." "Just making sure our business proceeds as scheduled," Reed replied smoothly. "The bank is prepared to close on the property sale as soon as roads clear. Your unexpected appearance doesn't change the legal status of your former home." Sheriff Denton looked uncomfortable. "Now, Mr. Reed, I believe there's been some new information." "Information that has yet to be validated by any court," Reed interrupted. "Until then, the settlement agreement stands." He turned his cold gaze back to James. "Unless you're prepared to face the original charges, I believe the statute of limitations on bank fraud is still active." From the doorway of Harold's house, Sarah appeared, her face tight with concern. Behind her, Abby and Ethan peered out, their young faces solemn. "Is that a threat, Reed?" Harold called out, his gruff voice carrying in the still morning air. Reed smiled thinly. "Simply a statement of fact. Mitchell signed a legally binding agreement relinquishing claims to the property in exchange for not facing criminal prosecution." He glanced dismissively at the Mitchell house across the way. "Surely you don't intend to return to a life of small-town obscurity? What could Pinecrest possibly offer that would be worth the risk?" Before James could answer, a commotion erupted from inside Harold's house. Max, despite his injuries, had somehow managed to push past Sarah and the children. He limped determinedly through the snow, his stitched wound leaving a trail of bright red droplets against the white. Reed instinctively stepped back as the German shepherd positioned himself between James and the perceived threat, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. "Max, no!" Ethan cried, rushing forward only to be caught by Frank. Dr. Foster emerged from the house, medical bag in hand. "That dog needs to be still. He's going to tear his stitches." Sheriff Denton's hand moved instinctively toward his holster. "Mitchell, control your animal." But James stood transfixed, watching as Max, clearly in pain but unwavering, maintained his protective stance. 4 years of waiting, of loyalty beyond reason, crystallized in this moment of selfless defense. "That's your answer, Reed," James said quietly, kneeling to place a gentle hand on Max's trembling back. "This is what Pinecrest offers. Something you could never understand." Reed's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "Sentimentality over a stray dog? That's what you'd risk everything for?" He turned to Sheriff Denton. "I want that animal controlled and quarantined. It's clearly aggressive." "He's protecting his family." Abby interjected, having edged closer despite Frank's attempts to keep her back. "Just like he protected them from the storm last night. He saved their lives." Reed scoffed. "Ridiculous." "Actually," Dr. Foster stepped forward, professional authority in her voice, "it's entirely accurate. That dog led the Mitchells through the blizzard to safety when their power failed. He sustained that injury, helping them escape a dangerous situation." She fixed Reed with a cold stare. "I've documented the case for my veterinary records." Sheriff Denton looked between the assembled groups, clearly weighing his options. "Look, Calvin, I understand you have business interests here, but these people have been through a lot. Maybe we should let things settle for a few days." "A few days?" Reed's voice rose. "While they fabricate more claims about my involvement in Mitchell's crimes?" "I don't think so." He pulled a document from inside his coat. "I have a court order authorizing the final property inspection this afternoon, storm or no storm. The sale proceeds Monday." He thrust the paper at Sheriff Denton. "I expect you to enforce it." The sheriff scanned the document with a frown. "This was issued before the storm. Judge Parker wouldn't expect—" "The judge's expectations are irrelevant," Reed snapped. "The order stands." Throughout this exchange, Max had remained vigilant, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes never leaving Reed. Now, as if making a decision, the dog turned and limped painfully back toward Ethan, who rushed forward to support him. The boy's face streaked with tears as he helped Max back toward the house. "It's okay, boy. You don't have to fight anymore." Something in the child's words and the dog's painful retreat seemed to shift the atmosphere. Even Sheriff Denton's posture changed, his official demeanor softening. "Mr. Reed," he said firmly, "I'm declaring a state of emergency for Pinecrest due to the storm damage. All non-essential business, including property transactions, are suspended for 72 hours. When Reed began to protest, the sheriff held up a hand. "That's final. You're welcome to contact Judge Parker once phone service is restored. Until then, I suggest you return to your rental." Reed's face flushed with fury. "You'll regret taking sides, Denton. All of you will." He stormed back to the sheriff's vehicle, slipping twice in the deep snow, his dignity as bruised as his expensive loafers were ruined. Inside Harold's home, Dr. Foster worked quickly to repair Max's damaged stitches. The dog lay still now, his energy spent, but his eyes remained alert, watching the doorway as if expecting Reed to return. "Reed shouldn't have moved at all," Dr. Foster scolded gently. "But I've seen worse patients. His protective instincts are quite remarkable." "Will he be okay?" Ethan asked, his small hand never leaving Max's head. Dr. Foster nodded carefully. "With proper rest and care, yes, but he absolutely cannot exert himself again." She looked pointedly at James. "Whatever confrontation is coming with Reed, Max needs to be kept out of it." James nodded solemnly. "We'll protect him now." He glanced toward the window where Sheriff Denton could be seen speaking with Harold and Frank. "Though I'm not sure how much time we have." Sarah joined him at the window. "What did Reed mean about the settlement agreement? Can he really still take our house?" "Be taken away, yes," James admitted. "When I signed the restitution agreement, I surrendered all claims to the property. Even if we prove Reed framed me, untangling the legal mess could take months." Abby, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "But that's not fair. He's the one who did something wrong." "Life rarely dispenses justice neatly, young lady," Harold said as he re-entered the house, stomping snow from his boots. "But sometimes people do." He exchanged a meaningful look with Frank. Frank nodded. "Sheriff's given us a 3-day window. He also mentioned that Mayor Knowles has called an emergency town council meeting for tomorrow morning." "What good will that do?" Sarah asked skeptically. Frank's expression was grim but determined. Reed's been buying up properties all over Pinecrest for his development, but he's been cutting corners, pressuring owners. There are people in town with stories to tell if someone gives them the opportunity." "And someone just did," Harold confirmed. "Denton's deputized Frank here as a special investigator for the duration of the emergency. Gives him authority to collect statements." James looked confused. "But why would he—" "Sheriff's not a bad man," Harold interrupted. "Just cautious. Reed's got money and connections, things Pinecrest needs, or seem to need." He glanced at Max, now sleeping under Ethan's watchful eye. "But some things matter more than progress." As the day progressed, Max's condition stabilized. Dr. Foster returned to her clinic once the roads were partially cleared, promising to return with antibiotics. The Mitchell family remained at Harold's house, their own home still without power and now officially in legal limbo. By evening, word had spread throughout Pinecrest about the confrontation. Neighbors began arriving with offerings, casseroles, firewood, and, most valuably, information. Business owners spoke of threats Reed had made regarding their properties. The former bank teller recalled witnessing Reed accessing the computer system after hours. The pieces of Reed's systematic dismantling of Pinecrest were falling into place. Through it all, Max maintained his vigil from Harold's living room floor, accepting gentle pats from visitors but never fully relaxing. His eyes constantly sought out members of his reunited family, as if reassuring himself they were still there. As night fell, a final visitor arrived, Martin Guthrie, James's former mentor from the bank. The elderly man entered with the help of a cane, his face grave. "James," he said without preamble, "Reed's called in his contacts at the state level. He's pushing to expedite the property transfer, regardless of the local emergency declaration." He handed James a thick folder. "This is everything I've collected over the years. Account discrepancies, timing anomalies, witness statements." His voice lowered. "It might not be enough to prove your innocence conclusively, but it's enough to cast reasonable doubt." James accepted the folder with trembling hands. "Why now, Martin? Why not 4 years ago?" Guthrie's aged eyes filled with regret. "Fear, mostly, and shame. Reed had half the bank board in his pocket." He glanced at Max. "I lack the courage your dog has shown." He turned to leave, then paused. "The town council meeting tomorrow. Reed will be prepared. He'll have lawyers, threats, promises of economic salvation." "And what will we have?" Sarah asked softly. From his place on the floor, Max raised his head, his ears pricked forward as if understanding the question. A low, determined rumble sounded in his chest. "The truth," James answered, his hand finding Sarah's, "and something Reed will never understand." The morning of the emergency town council meeting dawned clear and cold, the storm's fury replaced by a brittle stillness that made the mountain air seem like glass. James Mitchell stood at Harold's front window watching the sun glint off the snow-covered landscape of Pinecrest. In the reflection he could see Max lying on his makeshift bed, Ethan curled beside him, both still asleep. The sight stirred something in James's chest, a fierce protectiveness that had been dormant during the years of exile and struggle. "He's looking stronger," Sarah whispered, joining him at the window. "Dr. Foster says his fever broke during the night." James nodded, relieved but still troubled. "Today won't be easy. Reed will fight dirty. He always does." "So will we," Sarah replied with quiet determination. "For 4 years we accepted a shame that wasn't ours. No more." The town hall had been hastily cleared of storm debris, its ancient heating system struggling against the lingering cold. By 9 o'clock it was filled beyond capacity. Nearly every resident of Pinecrest had trudged through the snow to attend, their faces solemn but curious. Mayor Knowles sat at the center of the council table, flanked by 4 council members. Sheriff Denton stood near the wall, his expression carefully neutral. Calvin Reed arrived last, accompanied by a sharp-dressed woman who was clearly not from Pinecrest. They took seats in the front row, Reed's confidence evident in his posture despite the hostile glances directed his way. Mayor Knowles called the meeting to order with visible discomfort. Given the exceptional circumstances and the concerns raised by various parties, this emergency session will address the proposed development of several properties, including the former Mitchell residence. He cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Reed has the floor first as the primary stakeholder. Reed strode to the podium with the smooth assurance of a man accustomed to boardrooms and power. Thank you, Mayor. Citizens of Pinecrest, I understand emotions are running high, particularly with the unexpected return of the Mitchell family. He cast a dismissive glance toward James and Sarah. However, sentiment cannot override legal reality. The property in question was surrendered as part of a settlement for significant financial improprieties. My development plan represents progress for Pinecrest, jobs, tourism revenue, increased property value. The woman beside him handed him a stack of documents, which he placed on the podium. I've prepared economic impact statements for council members. Additionally, my attorney has confirmed that the temporary emergency declaration does not invalidate our scheduled closing. Further delay would constitute tortious interference with a binding contract. A murmur ran through the crowd. Legal jargon and threats had their intended effect, casting a pall over the gathering. Mayor Newell shifted uncomfortably. Thank you, Mr. Reed. We'll now hear from James Mitchell. James approached the podium slowly, conscious of the town's scrutiny. These were people who had once been his neighbors, who had watched his family flee in disgrace. 4 years ago he had left without defending himself, believing silence would protect his family from worse consequences. Today that silence would end. I won't pretend the past 4 years have been easy, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. My family lost everything, our home, our reputation, our community. I accepted punishment for a crime I didn't commit because fighting seemed impossible. He placed Martin Guthrie's folder on the podium. But sometimes the truth waits patiently to be discovered. Like a loyal dog on a porch, it doesn't give up. As if on cue, a commotion at the back of the hall drew all eyes. Harold Baker entered, supporting a limping but determined Max. Behind them came Ethan, Abby, and Frank Thompson. The German shepherd's bandages were stark against his dark fur, but his posture remained dignified, his eyes scanning the room until they found James. Reed immediately objected. This is absurd. Animals aren't permitted in official proceedings. Sheriff Denton stepped forward. Actually, there's no specific prohibition in town bylaws, and given that the dog situation is directly relevant to the matter at hand, I'm allowing it. Max made his slow, painful way down the center aisle, townspeople reaching out to gently touch him as he passed. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly from tense formality to something more personal, more emotional. James continued, emotion thickening his voice. 4 years ago, Calvin Reed orchestrated a complex fraud using my credentials at the bank. When discrepancies were discovered, he ensured I would take the blame. I have evidence. Transaction logs showing access from Reed's computer, witness statements from bank employees who saw him in the building after hours, and most damning, records of offshore transfers that funded his initial development projects. Reed's attorney rose sharply. These are defamatory accusations without foundation. My client will pursue maximum damages if such claims are entered into public record. Let him, called out Martin Guthrie from his seat near the front. The elderly banker stood, leaning heavily on his cane. I've submitted my sworn statement to Sheriff Denton and the State Banking Commission. I witnessed Reed accessing Mitchell's credentials on multiple occasions. I have documentation. Reed's face darkened. Guthrie, you senile old fool. That's enough, Mayor Knowles interrupted firmly. Mr. Reed, you'll have an opportunity to respond, but I won't tolerate personal attacks in this chamber." By now, Max had reached the front of the room. He stopped beside James, leaning slightly against his leg for support, but standing tall despite his injury. The visual was powerful. Man and dog, both wounded, but "I'm not here asking for sympathy," James continued. "What happened to my family can't be undone. But I am asking for justice, not just for us, but for Pinecrest." He gestured toward the townspeople. "Reed's development isn't about improving this town. It's about exploiting it. How many of you have been pressured to sell properties that have been in your families for generations? How many have been threatened with code violations that mysteriously appeared after you refused his offers?" Hands began to rise throughout the room. Mrs. Winters from the library stood. "He threatened to have my historical preservation grant revoked if I didn't support rezoning the Mitchell property." Old Mr. Gunderson rose next. Said he'd report my workshop as an environmental hazard if I didn't sell my 3 acres by the creek. One by one, residents came forward with similar stories. Reed's expression grew increasingly thunderous as his web of manipulation was exposed. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he shook her off, standing abruptly. "This is a coordinated character assassination," he shouted. "None of you were complaining when I promised to bring Pinecrest into the 21st century. Without my development, this town will die a slow death like every other forgotten mountain community." James remained calm. "Pinecrest doesn't need to be saved by destroying what makes it special. This town's value isn't in development potential. It's in the community that drops everything to help a neighbor during a blizzard. It's in the kind of loyalty that waits 4 years on a porch, never giving up hope." He rested his hand on Max's head. "Some things can't be bought or sold, Reed. Some things are simply worth protecting." As Reed began another angry retort, Max suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on something at the back of the hall. A new figure had entered. A slender man in a dark suit who surveyed the room with professional detachment. Reed fell silent at the sight of him. Sheriff Denton straightened from his casual stance against the wall. "Folks, this is Special Agent Anderson from the State Financial Crimes Unit. He's here in response to evidence submitted regarding the Mitchell case." Agent Anderson approached the council table, nodding respectfully to the mayor. "We've been reviewing documents provided by Mr. Guthrie and Sheriff Denton regarding potential banking fraud, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. Based on preliminary findings, we're opening a formal investigation." He turned toward Reed. "Mr. Reed, we'd like you to accompany us for questioning." The color drained from Reed's face. "This is ridiculous. I have rights." "Yes, sir, you do," Anderson agreed calmly, "including the right to have an attorney present during questioning. But this investigation is proceeding, one way or another." For a moment, Reed looked as if he might resist. Then, with a final venomous glance at James and Max, he allowed himself to be escorted from the hall by Anderson and a deputy. In the silence that followed his departure, Mayor Knowles cleared his throat uncertainly. "Given these developments, I move that we suspend all property transactions involving Mr. Reed's development company, pending the outcome of the investigation." He looked toward the council members, who nodded in unanimous agreement. The tension in the room dissolved into a buzz of conversation and relief. James knelt beside Max, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You kept faith long enough for the truth to come out." Sarah joined them, wrapping an arm around James's shoulders. "It's not over yet. There will be legal battles, testimony, but we'll face 'em together," James finished. "All of us." He looked up to include Ethan, who had pushed through the crowd to join them. The boy knelt beside Max, careful of his injured side. "Does this mean we get to stay in Pinecrest? In our house?" James and Sarah exchanged a look of cautious hope. For the first time in 4 years, the weight of false accusations had lifted. The road ahead would be challenging, but no longer impossible. "We'll see, buddy," James answered honestly. "But one thing's for sure. No matter where we go, Max comes with us." At the sound of his name, Max thumped his tail against the floor, his dark eyes filled with the simple, profound contentment of being exactly where he belonged. Spring came late to Pinecrest that year, as if winter had been reluctant to release its grip on the small Montana town. But by mid-April, the last patches of snow had finally surrendered to the warming sun, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the softening earth. The Mitchell house, once forlorn and abandoned, now stood freshly painted, its weathered golden hue restored to honor the loyal sentinel who had guarded it for so long. On the wide front porch, where Max had kept his 4-year vigil, a wooden swing had been installed. It creaked gently in the afternoon breeze as James Mitchell sat reading the letter that had arrived that morning. The official state seal at the top of the page glinted in the sunlight. "Dad! Dad!" Ethan's excited voice preceded the boy as he raced up the driveway, Max loping easily beside him. The German Shepherd's coat had regained its luster in the months since his injury, though a slight hitch in his gait remained, a permanent reminder of that fateful blizzard night. James folded the letter and smiled at his son. "Slow down, buddy. What's got you two so worked up?" Ethan skidded to a stop at the porch steps, breathless with excitement. "Mrs. Winters says they're going to put Max's story in the Historical Society display. They want pictures of him and everything." Max bounded up the steps with considerably more grace than his young companion, settling at James's feet with a contented sigh. At 8 years old, he still maintained his dignified bearing, though he'd relaxed considerably since the family's return. His days of solitary waiting were over, replaced by the comfortable routines of family life. Walks with Ethan, afternoons dozing in patches of sunlight, evenings surrounded by the family he had refused to forget. "That's quite an honor," James acknowledged, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "Though I'm not sure Max cares much about being famous." Sarah emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's this about fame?" As Ethan excitedly repeated the news, James held up the letter. "The state attorney general's office made it official. All charges against me have been formally dismissed and Reed's guilty plea has been accepted." He didn't elaborate on the details. That Calvin Reed, facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes, had negotiated a plea agreement that included restitution to the bank and the Mitchell family in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. "So it's really over? Completely?" James nodded, pulling her close as she joined him on the swing. 4 years of exile, and now, finally, vindication. The months following the town council meeting had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The state investigation had uncovered the full extent of Reed's crimes, not just the embezzlement that had framed James, but a pattern of fraud, coercion, and corruption that had targeted vulnerable communities throughout the region. Many in Pinecrest had come forward with testimony, their collective voices forming a devastating case against the developer. Through it all, the Mitchell family had remained in Pinecrest, slowly rebuilding their lives. The bank had agreed to restore their ownership of the house, and James had found work at Martin Guthrie's new financial consulting firm in the neighboring town. Sarah had returned to teaching, this time at Pinecrest Small Elementary School, and Ethan, initially shy and uncertain, had blossomed in the community that had rallied around his family. "We should celebrate," Sarah suggested, her head resting on James's shoulder. "Have everyone over this weekend. Harold, the Thompsons, Dr. Foster, everyone who helped it." "Everyone who helped Max," James corrected gently. "We're just the beneficiaries of his stubbornness." As if understanding, Max thumped his tail against the porch boards. His unwavering faith had become legend in Pinecrest, inspiring not just the Historical Society display, but a children's book by Mrs. Winters and even a mural on the town hall depicting his silhouette against the horizon. The sound of tires on gravel announced visitors. Harold Baker's truck pulled up, followed by Frank Thompson's sedan. From the second vehicle, Abby emerged, now 11, and carrying herself with newfound confidence. She had become a regular visitor at the Mitchell home, her bond with Max undiminished despite his reunion with his family. "We came as soon as we heard," Abby called, racing up to the porch. "Mrs. Winters told us about the Historical Society exhibit." Harold followed more slowly, the hint of a smile softening his perpetually stern expression. "Town's gone dog crazy. Next thing you know, they'll be putting up a statue." "Don't give 'em ideas," Frank laughed, joining the group. "Mayor Knowles is already talking about a Max Day celebration next year." The adults settled onto the porch while Ethan and Abby took Max to the backyard. Through the open windows, the sounds of children's laughter and a dog's happy barks filtered into the spring afternoon. "Got the good news, I see." Harold nodded toward the letter James still held. "He's this morning," James confirmed. "It doesn't erase the past 4 years, but it means the future is clear," Frank finished for him. "No more shadows hanging over you." The conversation drifted to town matters, the new businesses opening on Main Street, the summer festival plans, the improvements to the school where Sarah taught. Pinecrest was experiencing a modest renaissance, not through Reed's grand development schemes, but through smaller, community-driven initiatives. The town had discovered its own resilience, much as the Mitchells had. As evening approached, more neighbors dropped by, drawn by the impromptu gathering. Someone brought out a grill, another appeared with salads and desserts. The celebration Sarah had suggested materialized organically, the way things often did in small towns. Max moved contentedly among the guests, accepting treats and affection with aristocratic grace. When he tired, he retreated to the front porch, lying in the exact spot where he had maintained his years-long vigil. But now, instead of staring at the horizon with longing, he watched the gathering with satisfied eyes, his family within sight, his dutiful. As twilight deepened, Abby found James at the edge of the yard, watching the community that had embraced them. "I knew Max was special the first time I saw him," she said with the certainty of youth, "even when nobody else believed." James smiled down at her. "We all need someone to believe in us when we've lost faith in ourselves. Max never lost faith in us, and you never lost faith in him." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Abby spoke again. "My dad says we're staying in Pinecrest permanently now. He got promoted at the lumber mill." "That's wonderful news," James replied sincerely. The Thompsons had become like extended family in recent months, their shared experiences creating bonds that transcended their brief acquaintance. "I'm glad," Abby said simply. "I wasn't sure about moving here at first, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." She looked toward the porch where Max had dozed off. "Do you think he knew, somehow, that everything would work out in the end?" James considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Max understood something many of us forget, that loyalty isn't measured by immediate reward. It's about being present day after day, regardless of the outcome." He placed a gentle hand on Abby's shoulder. "You understood that, too, when you befriended him." The evening concluded with neighbors drifting home. Calls of "good night" echoing across newly green lawns. The Mitchell family lingered on their porch, savoring the peace that had been so long in coming. Max lay at their feet, his mission complete, his family restored, his place in the world secure. Ethan, fighting sleep but losing, leaned against his father's side. "Dad, do you think Max remembers when we were gone? Does he know how long 4 years is?" James gazed down at the dog, who had changed all their lives through simple, unfathomable devotion. "Time means something different for dogs, I think. For Max, there was just waiting and not waiting, being apart and being together." "And now we're together forever," Ethan murmured, his eyes drifting closed. "Yes," James agreed, his arm tightening around his son as Sarah's hand found his. Above them, stars emerged in the Montana sky, bearing witness to a promise fulfilled, a family reunited, and a loyalty that had never wavered through the longest wait. Max, sensing the moment, raised his head and met James' gaze with eyes that held no reproach for the past, only contentment in the present. Then, with a deep sigh of complete satisfaction, the faithful German shepherd closed his eyes and slept, finally at peace. Mac's unwavering loyalty speaks to a generation that understands the value of commitment. For 4 long years, through bitter Montana winters and sweltering summers, this German shepherd kept faith when the world had forgotten the Mitchells. His story resonates with those of us who've weathered life's storms, who understand that true devotion isn't measured in moments, but in years of quiet persistence. As we age, we recognize what truly matters, not the wealth Calvin Reed chased, but the bonds that sustained the Mitchells and transformed a community. Max reminds us of the pets who've seen us through our darkest hours, the silent companions who asked nothing but to remain by our side. His struggle mirrors our own experiences of injustice, patience, and eventual vindication. When that loyal dog finally reunited with young Ethan, we feel the precious weight of second chances, of relationships restored after we feared them lost forever. In a world that increasingly values the new and immediate, Max represents the enduring power of faithfulness, a virtue our generation still holds dear. His vigil on that weathered porch reminds us that some things are worth waiting for, that loyalty given freely is life's most precious gift. Hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.